And welcome, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us at the European Parliament in Strasbourg. My name is Joanna Drake. Today, Mariya Gabriel, who is the Commissioner for Innovation, Research, Culture, Education and Youth, and Janez Lenarčič, Commissioner for Crisis Management, will receive the scientific opinion on strategic crisis management in the European Union. Also, the statement on values and times of crisis, and the evidence review report on strategic crisis management in the European Union. First, Professor Tina Comes, the chair of the working group of the Consortium of European Academies, SAPEA, will present the group's report reviewing the existing evidence on strategic crisis management in the European Union, which informs the very scientific opinion. And then Professor Mariya Gabriel, co-lead of the crisis topic of the group of chief scientific advisors, will present the scientific opinion on strategic crisis management in the European Union. And last but not least, Professor Barbara Preinzak, chair of the European Group of Ethics in Science and New Technologies, will present the European Group of Ethics statement entitled Values in Times of Crisis. But first and foremost, I am very pleased to pass the floor to Commissioner Gabriel for her introductory remarks. Commissioner Gabriel.
Thank you very much, Joanna. Dear Commissioner, dear Janez, dear members of the Group of Chief Scientific Advisors, the Consortium of European Academies and the European Group on Ethics, ladies and gentlemen. Well, I would like to start saying that there is a growing public awareness that Europe and the world are being confronted with major disruptive events with far-reaching consequences for our societies. First, all citizens were witnesses of the lockdowns during the different phases of COVID-19 pandemic. And it was not only about a major health crisis, it had strong spillover effects on our security, on our economy that required immediate response. Now we are suffering the consequences of the war in Ukraine, not only in terms of geopolitical security, but also on disruptions related to population displacements or food and energy security. Our societies and our economies have evolved and changed much, so have changed the nature of the threats and the consequences. Staying united, that will be my first message. Staying united continues to be the best approach to face current and future large-scale crises, and it will be extremely hard for single countries to manage them alone. And I have the pleasure today with my colleague, Commissioner Lenarčič, after mandating 1 year ago the Group of Chief Scientific Advisors and the European Group on Ethics to provide independent advice on the crucial question, how can Europe reinforce its strategic approach to crisis management? We wanted actually to trigger a broader and multidisciplinary understanding benefiting of the top knowledge of our scientific and ethical advisors. And I know it required a lot of work, how to better integrate crisis management, preparedness and response to long-term crises into a single, coherent management framework. And you have worked on equally important issues like how crisis management policies can mitigate inequalities among regions and social groups, and how to ensure citizen participation in defining the responses. So, before passing the floor to my fellow Commissioner, Commissioner Lenarčič, allow me really to say big thank you for your work and to congratulate you already for the work that you'll present to us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you as well, Commissioner Gabriel, for your remarks. I now have the pleasure to welcome Commissioner Janez Lenarčič, as I said, the Commissioner for Crisis Management, whose presence here is particularly relevant in the context of the handover of these three reports. Commissioner Lenarčič.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure today to join Commissioner Gabriel. And I wish to thank our chief scientific advisors for the work that they are going to present today. Indeed, Europe is living through many interconnected crises. It appears that they are accumulating at an ever greater speed. I would first mention the climate change, which impact we feel increasingly, and then war, the pandemic and its lingering impact, digital and hybrid threats, economic and social hardships, and so on, so on. The list seems to get longer every day. And that's why I think it is extremely important that we receive an input from scientific community concerning the overview of the disaster landscape, and of course to get recommendations that are evidence-based on how we can improve our performance in managing the crisis. We have been ourselves working very hard recently on these issues, on how to enhance our crisis management system. And let me offer you two recent examples. First of all, we are trying to strengthen our emergency response coordination center so as to become a real hub in a cross-sectoral sense for European Union's crisis management. And this has operated very well in the case of, for instance, war in Ukraine, which has prompted the largest ever and the longest-lasting civil protection operation in the history of our Union crisis management. We have so far shipped to Ukraine almost 75,000 tons of relief emergency items. And this includes not just classical civil protection items, but it includes many cross-sectoral items. For instance, we include energy items, we include agricultural equipment and seeds. Cultural area is also included because we provided a lot of equipment to protect cultural monuments and so on. So this is an example of how we have managed to pool together all the various sectors and coordinate our response. The second example is the so-called disaster resilience goals on which we are working together with our EU member states. The idea is to identify what we need to put in place in order to be resilient, more resilient to the crisis that we can anticipate. And in this process, I really welcome this timely contribution from our scientific community, and I'm looking forward to hearing from it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Lenarčič. I now turn to the experts. As I said at the beginning, the scientific opinion on crisis management in the European Union is well informed by a comprehensive evidence review prepared by the Horizon-funded so-called SAPEA consortium of European academies. And on my left is Professor Tina Comes, who has chaired the SAPEA working group. And my question to you, Professor Comes, what is the latest scientific evidence when talking about crisis management, and what lessons can we draw from them?
Thank you, and thanks for the introduction and the great introductory remarks. It's a great honor today to hand over to you, Commissioner Gabriel and Commissioner Lenarčič, on behalf of the whole SAPEA working group, our evidence review report on strategic management of crisis in Europe. What we did to develop that report is we reviewed all the literature on strategic crisis management. And we've just heard about how many crises you are confronted with and what the implications of all these crises are. And as broad as the impacts of the crisis is also our evidence review report, because it covers a truly broad spectrum of questions that ranges then from crisis governance and trust and inequality to the use of technology and data and improved participation. And we also touch upon many of the issues that were mentioned before, from how do we deal with the logistics of hosting refugees to how to deal with cybersecurity, for instance. But even though we try to provide and dive in depth on these topics, we also acknowledge that the EU has been and will confronted with many different crises. So what we try to do in the evidence review report is to distill the generic principles of strategic crisis management that we see discussed in the literature. And from that, I would like to make 4 main points. First, crises have become the new normal. We have seen many new normals in the discussion of the COVID-19 pandemic, but we have to also recognize that we see an increasing number and severity of crises, and you've just mentioned many of them in your introductory remarks. The problem is that none of these crises is independent from each other. You've made the remarks about Ukraine and the subsequent energy and economic and refugee crisis. These crises cascade. There is no sector or region that is unaffected by crisis, even though they may happen very far away. Therefore, these crises really force us to think across sectors, countries and regions, and to coordinate. And especially for these transboundary crises, we see in the evidence a clear role for the EU. Secondly, time is running out. Crises really push us, and you, to urgently react to very complex problems that you normally would like to have time to really reflect and discuss. At the same time, despite their urgency, these decisions have very long-lasting implications. Implications for economic prosperity, for equality, for education, for growth. Implications for our chances also to combat climate change or the loss of biodiversity. And we really need to recognize that in our response to crisis, we can create potentially amplifying risks for other crises, but also we have an opportunity here. Now, Winston Churchill famously said, "Never let a good crisis go to waste." Because we live in an area of constant crisis that also have the tendency to amplify each other, managing crisis is becoming an integral part of setting strategic directions. And I would like to close with the fact that we also think there is hope, and a lot of hope. Over the past decades, we and you have developed many mechanisms. In research, we've developed, for instance, a lot of data and technology. Also in the Commission, in the EU, we have more information than ever before. And there are many policy options that we've put forward in our evidence review report, ranging from strategic foresight to training, for instance, of decision makers in crisis. So on the basis of our evidence review, we have then developed a set of policy options, which we herewith hand over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Komes, also for the valuable insight, but also for shedding a light of hope at the end of the tunnel. We also have with us Professor Mariya Gabriel, representing the group of Chief Scientific Advisors. We have heard from Tina that crises are numerous, they're diverse, they have cascading effects. Professor Komes highlighted also their systemic and global nature. And she also referred to a special role for the EU. Now, perhaps, can you tell us what can be done from the EU side in order to improve the management, to better respond to them? And what recommendations would you have?
Thank you, Joanna. Dear Commissioners, about 1.5 years ago, we spoke with you and you said that Europe urgently needs to keep up with the escalating crises on a European scale and on the global scale, and you requested informed science-based evidence about what could be done better. And at the time, we just believed that we are getting over COVID and the pandemic is almost under control. We talked about climate change and crisis that the climate change could trigger. And this was about half a year before the Russian invasion to Ukraine. That since tracked along the energy crisis and the cost of living crisis after that. So these are exactly the cascading transboundary transport effects that Tina Komes was referring to. So the request for a strategic crisis management Europe-wide was very timely, more timely than we believed, and more timely than some of us feared. Scientific evidence points to that we are going to see more of this kind of entangled crisis, and this is before the world is becoming more complex and interconnected, and the impact spread faster and further. So in the scientific opinion here, you find some recommendations how to cope with crisis in a complex world. So most important message is that crises are not going to come in silos anymore. So we therefore need mechanisms and interlinkages between instruments and legislation on the European level. We need to strengthen the European Civil Protection Mechanism and the Emergency Response Coordination for the future. Future crises escalate across borders. Therefore, the role of EC, European Commission, in the crisis is becoming more and more important all the time. And we also suggest here how to leverage from the diversity and autonomy of the member states and regions to get a fast and diverse response to the crisis. The future crises creep in unnoticed, and they have very long consequences. So here you also find recommendations how to look for weak signs on the horizons to find where they might kick in and how to deal with the long-term consequences or the crises. The future crises are characterized with complexity and a lot of uncertainty. Therefore, we recommend to build resilient infrastructure, resilient society, resilience instrument to respond faster. And the future crises cause more physical damage and physical suffering, but also more than just physical. And therefore, our recommendations are also concerned about non-material values. They're concerned about mental health, about cultural heritage, education, preservation of European culture, European values. Let me here also give a quote from Churchill, because what else were we fighting for? This is a scientific opinion from the best experts of Europe and worldwide of how to manage crisis, and I hope it helps to cope the future shocks.
Thank you very much, Professor Krusma, also for your insight and the synthetic overview of the recommendations you include in the report. I now also have the pleasure to welcome Professor Preinsak, the chair of the European Group of Ethics, and who is connecting with us remotely. May I invite you, Professor Preinsak, to say a few words about your group's statement? The title announces that the European Group of Experts provides reflections on the role of values in situations of crisis. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Joanna. Dear commissioners and everyone who's listening to us today, my colleagues have already emphasized, and you, Commissioner Gabriel and Commissioner Lenarčič, you've done this as well, the important role that good evidence plays in strategic crisis management. The EGE, the European Group on Ethics, underscores this in our statement. And we also draw attention to the important role that values play in this context. So as every policymaker knows, the way that we pose a problem or a question, and also the solutions and the measures that we develop, inevitably reflect certain value positions. And making these value positions explicit is really important in a democracy. Even when, such as in a crisis, it's not possible to have a public deliberation or public input into the values that should underpin our policies, it's really important to make the values explicit as well, because it helps people to understand better why certain decisions are made. And it can also help to increase support for the policies and measures in question. So one of the values that the EGE considers particularly important in the context of strategic crisis management is solidarity. We believe that solidarity has not been used to its full potential. Although we've talked about it a lot, we haven't really used it as we should have. If solidarity is used in a merely tokenistic way, or if it's mobilized for nationalistic purposes, it can do more harm than good. But if it's used fruitfully, it actually has a lot to offer. Because what makes solidarity special is, despite all the differences that inevitably exist between people, solidarity draws attention to what we all have in common, how human beings are connected and also interdependent on other species, which clearly is very salient in the crises that we are in. Solidarity draws attention to shared human vulnerabilities and needs, particularly in crises. It helps us to develop policies that address the needs of many, if not all people, instead of pitching different people and different groups in different countries against each other. So at the very minimum, solidarity can help us to critically think about the criteria that we use to include and exclude people from our policies. For example, why are some excluded from receiving certain types of support during crises? So one of the areas that we also cover in our statement is that solidarity together with human dignity also should guide how and whom we prioritize in the allocation of scarce resources in crisis situations. Also here, shared human vulnerabilities and also the equal worth of everyone are quite important and need to be considered systematically if we don't want to add further disadvantage to those that are already disadvantaged. So the EGE argue that political institutions, governments have a duty to combat poverty and decrease inequalities. If you now think, what does it have to do with crisis? My answer is, and our answer is, it has everything to do with crises. People who live in poverty are hit harder and faster by most crises. Societies, on the other hand, with good systems of social and economic support can get through almost any crisis better. This is one of the most important lessons to learn from previous crises, and we haven't learned it enough. So here it's a big call for institutionalized solidarity as well. This is actually what a lot of citizens want to see. So to conclude, there's a lot of emphasis these days on how important good communication is also during crisis. We agree with that. But good communication is only useful when there are good measures to communicate. So good measures need to be seen and recognized as effective, consistent, and fair. So I'll end here, but I hope that you will find helpful and interesting material in our statements. And I thank you for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Professor Preinzak, for those recommendations. And also thanks to all the members of the group for coming together and putting together this very insightful education for all. I would now like to turn to you, Professor Lenarčič, and you've been listening to all the presentations, and I'm wondering, what are your thoughts about them now?
Thank you again, Joanna. And many thanks to our experts and their presentations. I was really encouraged to listen to your presentations, primarily because I find out that we have been trying to work in largely the same direction. And let me offer you 3 examples for that. First of all, many of you said we need to strengthen the Emergency Response Coordination Center. This is what we're trying. This is one part of the Commission that works 24 hours, 7 days a week, round the clock, and it's already there, it's available. And we should strengthen its not only cross-sectoral activity, but also its ability to increase situational awareness, to work more on foresight, and to improve the decision-making. And we're trying to do all this, and this would certainly, in my view, boost the capacity of the European Union to respond to crisis. Second, we are also creating new opportunities for experts to exchange their views and experience. I would like from you all to see this exercise not only as one-off. These reports, in my view, certainly will have a lasting value, but we have also created, less than 1 year ago, a so-called knowledge network. It is a platform that is available to scientists and practitioners to exchange experience and offer advice. And I would strongly invite you all to continue to be active and to contribute to this knowledge network. Third, we really would like to strengthen our work on foresight. Obviously, it is inherent in an emergency that it comes always with some element of surprise. But at the same time, there is a lot that we can anticipate. And here, of course, we need scientific input. Without it, it won't work. Let me conclude with 2 points. First, solidarity. Solidarity is the engine of what we do. There can be no effective crisis management if there is no solidarity. And the Union Civil Protection Mechanism is a good example of that. All donations that are coming through the Civil Protection Mechanism to any affected country are voluntary donations by member states. And this means that as long as we have solidarity, we will have functioning operational crisis management, and we'll work on that. But there could be some further strengthening of this solidarity. It was mentioned by Professor to have institutionalized solidarity. And part of that has to deal with the budget. Because I noted in one of your recommendations that there should be more flexible financial instruments available, and I cannot agree more with that. We do now have so-called flexible instrument. It's called Solidarity and Emergency Aid Reserve. But it's such a small part of European Union budget that it would certainly have to be increased substantially if we are to be able to manage the crises that are coming. Thank you so much for your input and looking forward to our continued cooperation, including through the Knowledge Network. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Lenarčič, for sharing your thoughts on our work. I now like to give the floor to Commissioner Mariya Gabriel again for her concluding remarks. I'm sure you have many.
Thank you very much, Joanna. Well, first, let me join Commissioner Lenarčič in thanking all the members of the group of Chief Scientific Advisors, the European Academies, and our expert group on ethics for your wonderful work. And thank you very much, dear Professor, three brilliant ladies, for your recommendations and for your presentations today. Maybe first, I would like really to stress the importance of your independent and multidisciplinary scientific advice. Because with this independence of your advice, we can address these challenges and we can really adapt our responses. And I'm really very grateful for your recommendations. These recommendations are not the first one. You were with us since the very beginning of the outbreak with COVID-19. And thank you very much for associating the ethics dimension in your work. I think that when we talk about values, it was particularly important to listen how we can fulfill with content this beautiful world, and that's what you gave to us. Now, I fully agree with what was said about the growing complexity of crises, ranging from geopolitical instability to these large-scale health crises. And your examples were really enlightening about these needs to act with different instruments, from legislation to investment on our infrastructures. I like the word linkages or synergies, but we need really to strengthen this aspect, and your report, your documents are particularly enlightening. And yes, it's true that we have to deal with uncertainty, with complexity, but I think that it's really important to avoid to create a context of anxiety or fear. No, I see here trust in our ability to cope with this crisis. And even, Professor, you said hope. And that's, for me, a very positive message that we have with this discussion. Maybe last point, I really appreciate the link between these fundamental, for me, it's fundamental documents, with other policies, education, cultural heritage. So I think that, yes, it's really very important to make this link and to profit, really to benefit from listening your opinions, to have this evidence-based, and at the same time to have this human-centric and ethical approach. So I would like just to express again my gratitude. Thank you very much for your contribution. I'm sure that with Commissioner Lenarčič, that will be not our last discussion with you, but certainly this helps a lot. And again, thank you and congratulations to all the members that contributed to this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, commissioners. Thank you so much, brilliant professors. Female professors, those in the presence of the studio, but also those remotely. And this closes our very short exchange, a very significant exchange. It's an important coming together of thoughts and action, and foresight as well, plus hope. May I invite you for a picture to make sure that we have a good memory of this exchange. Thank you very much.